If you've been watching the last few videos, you've heard me say a name over and over, Matsuo Basho. I want to talk today a little bit more about who he was and why he matters so much to the history of Japanese poetry. Basics that you need to know about the era of Basho is he's in Edo. Edo is the favored cultural center of this era. The Tokugawa samurai family are in power administrating the state, but the emperor is back behind them, and he's from the Yamato family, and he has a heritage of his family ruling Japan from the imperial seat for almost a millennium. So, where does Basho come in? Why does Basho matter? Well, Basho comes from a family that would have been they would have been kind of more middle class. They would have worked for the Tokugawa family. So these are people who they're not servants in a sense that they're low class or that they have no rights. They're a middle class family who works with and alongside the samurai family. And so Basho would have received a similar education to the son of a samurai. So what we would think of as kind of an aristocratic education. Basho learned from a young age, given that he had access to this samurai level education. He would have learned not just what we think of when we think of samurais in popular culture, the art of the sword. He would have learned all the high arts, including especially the art of poetry. Now, poetry in Basho's day, as we've talked about, has kind of two major things going on in it. There's the old Tanka tradition, which goes all the way back to the Manyoshu in the Nara period, and the great Tanka people like Saigyo and Lady Murakami in the Heian period, but also this new Ranga tradition where the 5-7-5 stanza is beginning to be something that you write all on its own instead of doing the 5-7-5-7-7. It seems like this shouldn't matter too much, like how many lines you're writing when you're writing poetry. Like, why does that matter so much? Well, it does matter when it comes to artistic traditions. And, this is something that if you talk to anyone in any artistic tradition, whether it's architecture or visual art or dance, small tweaks sometimes become incredibly controversial. And so this new freedom that poets have during the Edo period to not just write tanka, but to write the haiku stanza, 5-7-5, opens up new possibilities. And Basho, from his sort of apprentice work onwards, shows that he's going to do new things. One of the things that he decides to do over the course of his career is find new tropes and new ways to talk about old things. And we've given the example already in a previous video of the frog haiku, where everyone who writes about frogs, which are a very popular topic in poetry, everyone who writes about frogs is writing about the sound of their croak. But Basho decides, I'm going to write about the sound of the water as they jump in. Once again, to us, it might seem small, but to Basho's audience, it would have seemed new. Another thing that Basho does, which is in line with tradition, but kind of pushes that tradition forward, is after he establishes himself as a major voice in poetry in Edo, he decides to go on lots of walking journeys. And so if you pick up a collection of Basho's work, there are many different versions. I recommend the Shambhala Classics version, translated by Sam Hamill. If you pick up a collection of Basho's works, you'll find that most of the works that are translated into English and published are actually descriptions of travels. So he does some short trips from Edo to famous temples or famous mountains or other cities. The Edo to Kyoto route was very well traveled, and if you go to Kyoto, there's this sense that you're going to the old capital. He has a great haiku, even in Kyoto, how I long for Kyoto when the cuckoo sings. This sense of, yes, I'm here, and yet there's this nostalgia for the heritage of this place, but also maybe this odd homesickness at home that many writers have written about. The most important travel narrative that Basho writes is called Narrow Road to the Interior, which can also be translated Narrow Road to the Deep North. And he wrote this when he was relatively older, towards the end of his career. He writes at the beginning of Narrow Road that his legs have started to ache when he travels more than they used to. Maybe he's suffering from arthritis. And he decides, I'm going to travel further into the deep north than I've ever gone, kind of up past Edo, up past, most of the famous sites along the coast, basically into the northern wilderness. And it's this book, Narrow Road to the Interior, that really defines Basho's mastery, both of prose and of haiku. And so Narrow to the Deep North is in the genre of haibun, which we talked about last time, this linked prose narrative and haiku. And he tells these wonderful stories of, going to these famous places. And, he says, Saigyo wrote this poem here. I'm going to write this poem in conversation with him. Remember, Saigyo is writing in the 1100s, and Basho is writing poems across 500 years in conversation with Saigyo. He also has a traveling companion, Sora, and kind of talks about friendship and brotherhood. He meditates in Narrow Road to the Interior on the questions of what it means to be a monk. He was in a very Buddhist culture. He himself was not a monk, but it was conventional to travel dressed like a monk if you wanted to be safe on the road. This is medieval Japan. There are brigands and bandits and things like these dangers on the road that most people at most times when they've traveled between civilized centers have faced and feared. And so he dresses like a monk so that, if a bandit comes upon him in the woods, the bandit will think, oh, this is a poor monk, I won't bother him. So Narrow Road to the Interior is well worth a read. I actually read it every year. I've done this for over a decade. I find it to be one of the most beautiful, calming, and introspective texts that I've ever read from Japanese culture or from any other culture. And I think one of the things that we see in Narrow Road to the Interior, and this is kind of a summing up of Basho's perspective, is that the human life and human experience of time and the life of nature and nature's experience of time are linked, and the more the human attends to nature, the more they will live in line with it. And this goes way back, past even the roots of Japanese culture into Chinese culture, into Confucianism, where this idea that there's this way of nature that is dictated by heaven, by this sort of divine pattern and law, and that humans who attend to nature and who even live in nature, go out from the bustle of the court to nature, are able to live not just more healthy lives, but even more moral lives and more spiritually attuned lives if they go into nature and live according to nature. This is something that Saigyo wrote about a lot. We talked about this in our introduction to Tonka. Saigyo was this model in the late Heian period of leaving the court and going out to the woods to live. So hopefully this has given you a picture of who Basho is and why he matters. Go pick up a collection of Basho. I already recommended the Shambhala Classics collection that has several of his earlier haibun, the entire Narrow Road to the Interior haibun, and also a collection of selected haiku. It's a great place to start getting to know this poet who I see as one of the major poets of world history. And if you like Japanese poetry and haiku at all, he's essential to know.